Our gospel lesson for today comes from Mark 15. At 3:00, Jesus cried out with a loud voice, "Eloi, Eloi, lama sabachthani," which means, my God, why have you forsaken me?" When some of the bystanders heard it, they said, "Listen, he is calling for Elijah." And someone ran, filled a sponge with sour wine, put it on a stick, and gave it to him to drink, saying, "Wait, let us see whether Elijah will come to take him down." There were also women looking on from a distance. Among them were Mary Magdalene and Mary, the mother of James the younger and of Joseph, and Salome. These used to follow him and provide for him when he was in Galilee. And there were many other women who had come up with him to Jerusalem. This is the word of God for us, the people of God. Thanks be to God. You may be seated.
Good morning. The past few weeks, we've been in a series about the different witnesses at the cross. The Dye sisters, Pastor Christy and Pastor Grayson, have preached on the beloved disciple, the other victims, the soldiers. But today I would like us to turn our attention to the most faithful disciple, Mary, the mother of Jesus. Our gospel for today, Mark, leaves out the story of the virgin birth, and this tells us that Mary's importance or significance comes not from only the fact that she was the mother of Jesus, but from the fact that she was a disciple. But I believe that Mary, the mother of Jesus, the one who labored through birth to bring Jesus into this world, the one who intimately walked with and talked to and attended to her child, that Mary was not just any old disciple, but that Mary, the mother of Jesus, was the most faithful disciple. Because, as we hope mothers to be, Mary was Jesus' biggest supporter. We hope and pray that everyone has a motherly figure like a Mary in their lives. And it's not only Jesus' mother, but as the most faithful disciple, I contest that Mary experienced the crucifixion just a little bit more intimately than the rest of the disciples did. For Mary, the scene at the cross was not just the crucifixion. Mary was not just merely watching the trial of an innocent man. No, Mary was watching her son die. For Mary, the crucifixion was her son's execution and funeral. And I wonder what Mary felt when her son cried out with his last few breaths, asking God why he had left him. I wonder if Mary was also questioning and wondering whether or not God had left her. I mean, would that not have been a fair question for Mary? Would it not be a fair assumption that Mary, like the other people who have or are enduring difficult, tumultuous, or unprecedented circumstances, like times of war, death, sickness, and disaster, to feel that God had left her, to feel that God was far from her, to feel that God was silent, to feel anything but loved by God, to question everything she once thought she knew about God, to question the very fabric of her religion and culture. Would it not be fair to assume that Mary was worried and doubtful of God's presence at the cross? But nonetheless, regardless of her doubts, regardless of how difficult it was, Mary, the most faithful disciple, was present there at the cross with Jesus. Unlike Peter and unlike Thomas, who, like a lot of people, turned away from Jesus during their season of reasonable doubts. And I say reasonable because if you just pause and take an honest look at this situation, and you don't jump to the resurrection, but you stay there, present at the cross, at the crucifixion, then this scene is a terrible and mighty hopeless situation. This situation does not reflect an on-time or all-powerful God. Nor does this situation represent a just system or moral universe. No, this is one of those situations where a horrible thing happens to a great family. This is a situation where something awful happens to good people. But perhaps Jesus crying out, "Why, oh why have you forsaken me?" was not a cry, but a prayer. Maybe Jesus was praying on behalf of the disciples, on behalf of Mary, as an advocate who understood what they were feeling. Perhaps Jesus prayed, "Why have you forsaken me?" instead of declaring that God had forsaken him, to leave space for divine response and action. Perhaps Jesus' cry was not a cry of despair, not only a cry of despair, but a prayer of hope to a God who never leaves nor forsakes us. Because regardless of what the situation appeared to be, God is in fact still there. As wherever the Son Jesus is, God the Father is also. So it was God who knew Mary was going to struggle with the events at the cross, as she was watching her son be executed, as she was watching her son die before her very eyes. It was God who appointed the beloved disciple to look after her and care for her. It was God who, at what may have been the lowest and most difficult time of Mary's life, had prepared to accommodate her grief, who had prayed for her, who had made plans on her behalf, plans to prosper her and not to harm her. Even though it may have not seemed like God was there, God was still there. And oh, what a God we serve, who at our lowest points is planning to uplift us. Oh, what a God we serve, who makes a way past our anger. Oh, what a God we serve, who makes a way regardless of our doubts. Oh, what a God we serve, who makes a way through our confusion. Oh, what a God we serve, who even in our fear, sadness, and depression still makes plans for us, still makes a way for us, still assures us that we will be comforted and that we are not alone. Because even though it may seem like God was not there, God was there, and God is there with us at our lowest moments, making plans on our behalf. Even in what many would consider as the most tragic scene in the entire Bible, there's still reassurance. Without knowing about the resurrection, the cross still reassures us of God's everlasting presence. But how can we be still and steadfast when we feel like God has left us? How can we feel the presence of God during our most challenging times? How can we reassure ourselves when we're doubting God? How can we remain faithful during difficult times? Is that not the crux of the matter after all? Is this not what all the fuss is about? People don't lose their religion during the good times, but the challenging. When life is good, we know God is at work. But when times are bad, when things aren't going our way, or at least how we expected things to go, we stop singing, "Oh, great is thy faithfulness," and we start wondering where God is. We stop going to church and loving the message, and we start wondering if religion has an answer for our current situation. But maybe there's something we can learn from the most faithful disciple, Mary, the mother of Jesus, about remaining faithful during times of strife. Because if you just look back across Mary's life, you'll see it was filled with constant turmoil. I mean, when you look at Mary's life, it is truly a life full of turmoil, as it is a story about a young girl, and might I add, a poor young girl, who had a baby out of wedlock, who had to live as a refugee during labor, who watched people mock, abuse, and hates her son. Mary was a mother who had to bury her son. Mary had to watch her beloved die in agony. And yet and still, Mary walked with God. She had conversations with the angels. And she knew Jesus as only a mother could know her child. Is this what it means to be blessed and highly favored? Through Mary, maybe we can see what it looks like to be loved by God and what it means to be faithful. There was an early Christian belief that claimed following God meant to embrace suffering. And to a degree, if you just examine Mary's life, it looks as if there may be some truth to that. In Luke chapter 2, a prophet tells Mary that she will suffer along with Jesus, almost as if Mary had no choice in the matter. But Mary does have a choice. She does not have to follow Jesus through Galilee. No, she chose to, out of a love for him. Mary endures voluntarily. She remains faithful voluntarily. But I would still not say that Mary embraced or chose suffering, as what happened in Mary's life was unexpected. Having a baby out of wedlock was unexpected. But God was present, and God had a plan for what Mary could not plan for. Having to be a refugee was out of her control. But God was present and working to bring peace to a chaotic situation. And her son's death was out of her control. But God was present there with her, planning for her, even though it did not seem like he was. The pain and suffering were out of Mary's control. It was all unavoidable. It was all inevitable. But it was life. And as life is for all of us, it comes with unexpected challenges. But in the unexpected and in the most difficult seasons of life, God is in the midst. Because God is with us, not only for the highs, but for the lows. I remember growing up, my father would always tell me that what happened to me was out of my control. But how I chose to react would define me. And when you look at Mary and all that happened to her, when you consider all that she went through in her life and how difficult some points of her life were, you cannot help but also see a woman of great faith. As no matter what happened to her, and no matter how difficult it was, she continued to walk with Jesus. When things went wrong and when times got hard, Mary got closer to the Son. And at any and every traumatic experience of Mary's life that we have account of, we find her voluntarily walking with God. Even after her son is tried and is being executed, we find Mary in silence at the foot of the cross, in the presence of God. So to be faithful is not to be absent of strife, nor is it to embrace suffering. But to be faithful is to seek the presence of God no matter what is happening in your life, as that is what Mary, the most faithful, did. Faith is not about receiving something, but about being something. Mary, the most faithful, shows us that faith is about being with God and always seeking the presence of God. And after Mary had just watched the slow, agonizing death of her beloved son, she got up 3 days later and went to anoint her son's dead body in remembrance of everything her son had done. You see, Mary went to the tomb on Easter not to see her circumstances changed, not to see a miracle. No, Mary went to the tomb thinking that it was finished. She went to the tomb to honor the memory of her son. If you think about it, Mary going to the tomb was an act of devotion. She went out of a reverence for all Jesus had done in her life. If you think about it, the most faithful disciple went to the tomb to worship for the memories of the time she had spent with Jesus. Mary went to the tomb to worship for the time Jesus turned water to wine and brought something out of nothing. Mary, the most faithful disciple, went to the tomb to worship for the time Jesus told the lame to walk and brought hope to a hopeless situation. Mary, the most faithful disciple, went to the tomb to worship for the time Jesus raised her friend's brother from the dead and gave him new life. Mary, the most faithful disciple, went to the tomb to worship for how Jesus had changed her life. Mary, the most faithful disciple, went to the tomb to worship for all she had seen and experienced Jesus do. And we know how the story ends. We know about the resurrection, but let's not go to that yet. Let's stay here and pay close attention to the fact that Mary did not go to the tomb for that. In her pain and in her suffering, this woman, who can only be defined by her great faith, went to the tomb not only to grieve, but to worship and to give thanks for the memories she had of Jesus. And you see, memories, they exist outside of time. So Mary, the most faithful disciple, went to the tomb still seeking God through all her trauma, with all her heartbreak. Because Mary, the most faithful, knew that God would never leave nor forsake us. Because God is faithful and is with us now and forever. So maybe you and I can be a little more like Mary and be a little more faithful and continue to seek and recognize and know that God is with us throughout the highs and the lows of life, because God is faithful to us and has never and will never leave or forsake us.